She was 60 feet from the lectern when the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the prepared agenda. Cameras clicked, wine cooled in crystal, and somewhere near the back, a man in a pressed suit made a joke that died on his lips. Alexandra Ashcroft, who could read a market shift in a single glance, stopped mid-sentence as the air left her chest. For a second it looked like fatigue, an executive running on the machine of obligations, but then her jaw slackened and her hands fumbled at the podium. Her face lost color, as if someone had drawn the light out of it. Bernard saw the slump before anyone else. He was supposed to be mopping by the east wall, a late-night shift that paid for a winter of heating and the occasional extra tuition for his daughter. He kept his mop in the far corner out of habit, one shoulder steadily pushed into the rhythm of a task that did not demand attention. When Alexandra toppled, it looked to him the way a tree looks, only after you hear the roots pain. Sudden, irretrievable. He dropped the mop, hearing the scrape shout in the hush, and moved. The boardroom lights reflected on the polished floor like a surface that didn't admit fingerprints. Bernard pushed through a knot of suits and security vests, instincts governing his hands. Check airway, call for help, compress. He had been a principal once, a fact he kept folded in a drawer back home alongside a framed photo and a brittle nameplate. But in that quick moment, there was no title to consider. There was only a woman on the carpet and a chest that had to be pressed back into offering breath. He knelt, palms locking over the sternum, and began compressions. The sound of his palms on bone and fabric became the only sound in a room stuffed with people who could not, or would not, move. A man in a tailored jacket barked for someone to call 911. A woman with lacquered nails shouted something about liability. Someone shoved at Bernard's shoulder. He pivoted on an elbow and kept going. "Get off him," a security man growled. "He's a janitor. You can't—" "Keep your hands off," Bernard said, not stopping. He counted under his breath the way he taught children to count down a school bell. Steady, metronome true. 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The boardroom filled with a thin electric panic, faces stretched and stratified, the 3-tier world of the assembled elite tapering into a thinned-out ring around a man in scuffed shoes who would not allow the current to stop. When she first coughed, it was a small sound, a cracked thing like gravel, then a sobbing breath, and the room erupted from its frozen geometry into motion. Paramedics, a stretcher, crisp-voiced instructions. Someone grabbed Bernard's sleeve and jerked him backwards, as if he were a problem to be handled, rather than the reason their leader might still be breathing.
A photographer, always ready, snapped an image of the rescuer pulling away, the angle catching the last smear of Bernard's hand on Alexandra's collar. The single frame, grainy, frozen, ambiguous, found its way into a whisper network before Bernard had even left the boardroom floor. He was thanked in an envelope the next morning, a terse HR letter stating they had mutually agreed to let him go. The phrase had the kind of bureaucratic smoothness that was meant to sting less than it did. He stood in the HR office while the woman in the seat across from him slid the paper across the desk. Her shoes were a little too high for the carpet, her sympathy a scripted curve. They didn't call it fired. Company policy prevented that bluntness, but the effect was the same. A sealed envelope, a name cleared from the roster, the invisible removal of someone from the map of acceptable faces. Outside, the headlines had already curved into something else. A local blogger posted a frame from the earlier photograph, the precise moment Bernard's palm had found Alexandra's chest, and attached a caption that reframed the story in a single poisonous projection. "Inappropriate contact," read the headline. The comments bloomed like mold. People who had never set foot in the boardroom drafted verdicts and delivered them by tapping thumbs over tiny glass screens. The stillness of the rescuing act, stripped of time and context, became a smear designed to fit a narrative everyone found comfortable. A man beneath her status, reaching where he should not. Bernard watched the cascade from the kitchen table of a third-floor walk-up where the radiator clanked like a dismissed heart. Molly, 7, was coloring at the kitchen table with concentration so fierce it registered as a physical presence. She drew hard, the crayon edge biting into paper. A house with a single square window and a sun that looked stubbornly like a coin. Neighbor Janet buzzed at the door with a bag of groceries and a voice that kept the apartment tethered to the world beyond bills. "You did what you had to," Janet said, as if that settled everything, passing Bernard a mug of coffee that had been brewed already too long. Her attention fell for a moment on a frame propped against the microwave, a photograph of a smiling classroom, little hands up in rows, and Bernard in the center with a nameplate bright and proud, B. Kellerman, Principal. The glass of the frame caught the light and split it into lines. He had been principal of Lincoln Elementary for nearly a decade, a place that smelled like crayons and glue and the particular rich chaos of children. He'd started every morning with a list and ended every afternoon with a roster of names that he knew by sight. Then the budget cuts came. County ledger lines thinned to a razor, facilities closed, staff laid off. Bernard's position was eliminated in one of those bureaucratic gusts that pretend to be wind and turn into hurricanes for people in modest apartments.
He did not grieve loudly. He found a night shift that paid in cash and the quiet dignity of occupation. He scrubbed marble in corporate lobbies so Lincoln Elementary could keep a market program alive for children who could not afford art supplies. Molly looked up from her drawing the way only children can when they know grief is near and will not be spoken of. "Daddy, are you going to go to the school tomorrow?" she asked, without the self-consciousness of a child who could guess too many answers too young. Her hair was pooled against the tabletop like a dark river. She did not yet understand the weight of titles. Only the person who folded lunch sandwiches for her and kept stories saved him his pockets for nights like this. "I'll be there," Bernard said. He ran a thumb over the photo's edge, feeling the slight splinter of frame. His voice was no louder than the radiator. "They're short on volunteers for the reading program. I'll see the kids in the morning." That evening, he burned that image a little brighter in his mind, the way people do with photographs they intend never to lose. He folded his principal's nameplate into a drawer out of habit, not shame, and placed a folded badge from Lincoln Elementary beneath it. Faded, stubborn, proof of work that did not vanish simply because a ledger said so. The drawer smelled of old paper and mint gum. The smear crawled outward. Screenshots flew from phone to phone. A late-night host used the grainy freeze frame as a prop, mouthing a mockery that bribed the room for laughter. HR offered a statement. "Our top priority is the safety and dignity of all attendees." The attackers steered clear of the paramedics' report and the surveillance footage that, if watched in full, made a different kind of story. Context is messy, tedious. It does not condense into the tribes of trending hashtags. Bernard took a stack of job applications, filled them out with the careful handwriting of a man who had always loved lists, and sent them into a digital wind that either ignored him or returned him polite automated declines. The phone at the apartment shrank his world. Potential employers did not call. The landlord's voice, once convivial, thinned into a ledger of reminders. Rent was due, and the envelope from HR had already sealed the ledger against him. Molly slept that night with her crayon drawing under her pillow as if it could be a talisman. Janet set the plate of leftover soup on the table like a small ceremony. There were days he felt invisible in ways that the word did not cover. People who had passed him in the lobby last week now crossed the street to avoid the shape of his hat. He rode the bus with a coat that hung at his shoulders and felt the way eyes slid like water off the surface of someone they decided not to notice. He checked his watch between cleaning jobs, counting appointments that were not appointments, phone calls he expected but did not receive.
The principal inside him continued to organize, a list of names in his head, a rota of what had to be handled first: rent, food, school forms for Molly. Powerful people always had cleaned away their vulnerabilities. Executive clean rooms, plastic surgery, silent retreats. But a heart that stops does not consult a calendar. She had spent a life building consequence. Shareholder meetings, acquisitions that swallowed competitors whole, philanthropic gestures that created corner towers with her name on them. She had been taught to manage outcomes. She had not been taught what it was like to be the one whose chest failed them in the light. The paramedics' report was routine, clinical, and it made no moral judgments. That was the point of a report, to be useful and ungilded. Alexandra brushed her hair in a bathroom mirror with the kind of mechanical precision she had taught public boards. Her staff briefed her with language meant to reduce panic. Stable, monitoring, expected to recover. A lawyer suggested a statement. A PR team drafted phrases with careful empathy. The whole apparatus moved, slick and practiced. It was only when she was alone in the penthouse, where the city spread beneath glass and ochre, and she had the rare privacy to be human, that she heard in her memory the voice that had brought her back. It was not loud. It was the press of a palm, and a count softened with urgency. It set the room spinning not on the axis of guilt, but of curiosity. Who had been the person who moved when everyone else watched their shoes? The candidate she expected for that act was not the one her mind immediately supplied. The thought lodged like a splinter.
She asked security to pull the full footage, not the section the camera feed sold to the network, but every angle, the minutes before, the footsteps in the hall, the shuffle of shoes on carpet. That decision was odd for someone who had built a life on controlling optics. Why look deeper if the headline was fine? Because in the moment between breath and darkness, she wanted to know who it was that did not flinch. The footage showed a man who did not look like a hero in the classical sense. He had the kind of hands that showed habit rather than hobby, palms calloused, nails with faint dusting of grout. He moved without self-consciousness. He did not worry about the cameras or the opinions of the people around him. He only moved toward the need. Back in the apartment, Bernard lay on the couch the night after the firing and listened to Molly breathe. She had dozed beside him with a book between them. Pages sagged with the weight of the day.
He would not let the story of the photograph be the way the world remembered him. He fed the cat an extra scoop and made a list, not of grievances, but of practical things. Call the credit union, check the immunization forms for school, borrow a suit for the scholarship dinner next month. Small survival details felt like anchors. They prevented the vertigo of shame from dragging him under. Outside, the social barrage continued. A commentator who had not been in the room opined on his morning show about boundaries and optics. The smear developed its own life, independent of fact. Bernard's name became a line item in conversations he never attended. When his neighbor ran her errands, she fielded a grocery clerk's opinion about the man who had been in the papers. They spoke as if reputation were a garment that could be zipped off and tossed like last season's coat. He took a job flipping omelets at a diner for a week, cash under the table, quick pay, a job that allowed him to be on the street for when Molly left for school. The owner was kind but tight-lipped about hiring someone with the look of a man who had once run a school. Bernard kept his back straight, an old muscle memory of posture he used when giving assemblies. Molly visited the diner once with Janet and declared the scrambled eggs too bright, and Bernard laughed as if he had all the time in the world. At night, he patched shoes for neighborhood kids and helped resolve playground feuds as if the principal's instincts were a habit you could not simply fold away with a nameplate. He read to a group of after-school kids in the church basement on Wednesdays at 6, voice low and patient. The community had not erased him entirely. He had not erased them. Alexandra watched him in the footage hour after hour, not able or willing to let the images flatten into a single frame. She rewound the moment from different angles and noticed things other people did not. The way he checked her sternum for responsiveness, the way he curved his fingers to avoid pressure under the ribs because he'd been taught the proper technique, the soft countdown he murmured as if reciting a lesson plan. There was something in his rhythm that was methodical, pedagogical. She paused the tape on his face. His mouth was a thin line of concentration. She felt a weight lift and settle at the same time, a lifting of the distance between label and action, a settling into a responsibility she had not yet claimed. When the first wave of comments turned into a campaign, the staff advised her to release a statement clarifying policy and expressing condolences for a distressing scene. It was the kind of safe action that kept press releases tidy. She did not want to be tidy. She wanted to know whether the man who had saved her life was a man who had once commanded a classroom of 30 tiny mouths, or whether he had simply been the right person in a room of the wrong people. The search for context often begins with small things. Anyone who has ever run a school or led a small nonprofit knows that every person leaves traces: a sticker on a notebook, a voice message saved on a phone, a coffee mug with a name. Bernard's traces lived in the open drawer in his apartment and in the rhythm of his hands. He had not hidden the truth so much as folded his life into practicalities. Poverty, after all, does not always shame itself into invisibility. Sometimes it simply requires people to do double shifts, to keep their competence in one pocket and their income in another. At 2 a.m, Alexandra replayed the footage and watched the same man stand up after the paramedics had taken her away. He wiped his palms on his pants and listened to the sharp legal cadence of a floor manager giving orders. She watched him being pushed back toward the lobby, an officer's hand on his shoulder like it could redirect him, and she watched his face not flare in anger but mute into something like retreat. She found herself thinking of the angle the camera caught of his jacket. On the inside of the cuff there was a small scuff that looked as if he had rested his hands on a small desk for years. She asked who he was. Her assistant told her the company's event manager, an outside cleaning service, a temp run through an agency. That answer should have satisfied her. Instead, it opened a curiosity. The next morning, Bernard woke before dawn, the apartment a quiet temple of its small needs.
Molly still slept peacefully, a small boyish thing in a nightdress she had outgrown. Bernard sat at the kitchen table and folded laundry, with hands that had been trained to order things into tidy rows. He set aside a t-shirt and a pair of pants for Molly's school the next day. He rehearsed a morning greeting for the reading program. He checked his phone for messages, for calls that never came, for an invitation that would not arrive. He had to go out that day to cash a check that had not arrived. The smear had made it difficult to find work with any degree of security. He wore a coat that had seen better winters, and a pair of shoes he had resold twice. He took a route he had always taken, past rows of early closing delis and shuttered stores, and the church where he volunteered quietly on Wednesdays. He walked with the kind of slow, economical pace he had when shepherding children across busy streets, efficient, watchful, and gentle. At the lobby entrance of Ashcroft Towers, a security guard squinted at him. He made a note of Mr. Kellerman's name, and then, with the dry, routine hostility of a place that preferred its workers anonymous, told him to keep moving. The guard did not recognize him as the man who had saved the CEO's life. People rarely do. They see instead the badge of an occupation, and project a caricature onto it. Inside the towers, the boardroom had a smell that included polished wood and the faint residue of refrigeration units.
Bernard's mind, even as he walked away, held the count he had used as if it were an incantation. 2 breaths, 30 compressions. He had seen firsthand how fragile breath could be. He kept that memory like a lantern. That afternoon, a friend texted him a link. "You were trending," the message read, blunt and not unkind. He opened it with the detachment of someone who had been a man long enough to know that being seen could lead to either rescue or ridicule. The images were worse in sequence than in memory, an edited clip, a voiceover that took liberty with nuance. Beneath it, comments streamed like a river of judgment. A handful defended him with a ferocity that startled him. Others condemned him in a language that cut with efficiency. He sat back in his chair and looked at Molly's drawing taped to the refrigerator. A child's son, a crooked house with a door that had a heart drawn on it. He drew a breath in and out, felt the old principle's muscle respond. Plan, protect, teach. He wrote a note to himself to call Lincoln Elementary's PTA coordinator in the morning, if only to make sure the reading program would continue. The smear did its work on the world around them. A neighbor refused to let Molly play at a supervised block party. A bus driver looked past Bernard as if he were a rumor rather than a person. The small indignities stacked until they became a pile heavy enough to sag the shoulders. There were nights when Bernard held his daughter and wondered what his life had become, whether the dignity of his prior title mattered in a world that scrolled headlines and then moved on. When Alexandra watched him again on the footage, she stopped the tape at a detail others would ignore. For a half-second, the camera caught the edge of a folded card inside his palm, a small thing, insulated from the fuss of the world. It looked like the corner of a school photograph, the sort of card you keep in your wallet because it has a face on it you want to remember. She froze the image. The man in the frame, who everyone else called a janitor, had an expression in that fraction of time that no trending hashtag would ever invent. A quiet calculation grounded in responsibility. Her assistant suggested a statement. She ignored it. Instead, she asked for more. The hours before the event, the security logs, the names of the people who had coursed through the boardroom before the collapse. She did not yet know what she would do with the knowledge. She only knew she needed to walk a step into the painful place where she might be wrong about herself. There is a particular kind of nervousness that comes from knowing you have power and fearing you have used it carelessly. For all her wealth, Alexandra had never been granted a free pass from shame. The corporate world had taught her to meet accusations with metrics. But metrics do not breathe or count compressions. Metrics do not know the sound of a child's sleeping breath.
In the quiet of the penthouse, that knowledge sat like a weight. Outside, Bernard walked home under the lamplight, the city an anthology of small economies. He unlocked the apartment, smelled the soup Janet had left, and saw Molly awake at the kitchen table working on a new crayon sun. "How was work?" she asked, looking up as if he brought news with him. "Fine," he said. It was an ordinary answer. He set a plate in front of her, and they ate in a kind of practiced economy, trading small stories about their day like currency. He told Molly he would go to see the kids at Lincoln the next morning, and that she could come on Friday for reading if she wanted. Molly beamed as if he had offered her the moon. He kissed her forehead and tucked hair behind her ear, the way a principal might tuck a stray scrunch of paper into a bulletin board, gentle, tidy, and careful. He did not know then that a woman's curiosity would soon find him. A few blocks away, Alexandra pressed a finger to the frozen image on the screen.
Bernard's face in a captured second of human action, and the line between what had been assumed and what was true narrowed into a question. She put down her glass, the crystal chinking like the bell of a schoolroom that once meant the day had begun. The city lights blinked. The press of the world beyond her windows continued its noise, but inside the penthouse, a decision was forming that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with the soft, uncompromising fact that someone had saved her life. She made a call, not to PR, not to legal, but to the security director. "I want the entire footage," she said simply, "and I want the name of that man." "Get the entire footage," Alexandra told the security director again, and this time her voice had the stubborn, private steadiness of someone who had decided to go past a press release. She did not look like someone delivering a talking point. She looked like someone who had been startled by a truth she could no longer walk around. "Give me his name." The security director hesitated, then tapped a few keys and read aloud a name that landed in the penthouse like a pebble in still water. Bernard Kellerman. The syllables felt ordinary, the way a name on a list always does until someone you owe everything to occupies the space behind it. She held the file for an afternoon. Watching raw footage was an odd intimacy, a private, surgical thing that let her unpick the frayed edges of the public version. In frame after frame, she watched Bernard move with the economy of someone who had practiced the same motion until it became second nature. He checked for pulse with a regard that was neither clinical nor theatrical. It was a practiced, patient survey of a body that had taught him how to see what was essential. He set his weight, he breathed the count under his breath, he listened for a cough like a person expecting a child to speak on cue.
That evening, with the cameras of the world having already decided their story, Alexandra did something that made some of her staff breathe out slowly in relief, and others sit forward with suspicion. She called the number on the vendor contract and asked, bluntly, for Bernard's address. The call was clinical: names, invoices, a list. The vendor hesitated, then offered an intersection, an older brick row house a few neighborhoods over, 2 blocks from a parish whose steeple had a cracked face. She flew there the next day. The city at that hour wore a different temperament than the one she kept behind her glass walls. Streets here stayed softer at the edges. The lights cast pools instead of floors, and the people who passed each other had faces that told you where their lives nodded. Alexandra's SUV rolled to a stop in front of a narrow stoop. The building held the smell of old wood and warm laundry and something faintly sweet, cinnamon from a neighbor's kitchen. She hesitated at the bottom of the steps, suddenly modest under the simplicity of the row. This was not her world of towers and receipts. It was a neighborhood stitched together by routines and small economies. She knocked. The door opened to a compact apartment that smelled like soup and baby shampoo. A rack of coats jutted by the entry, a tiny collection of school projects taped to the wall. Molly, who had watched her on television with her father blurred in the background of a picture, stood in the kitchen, with hair a little untamed, a crayon smudge near her lip, and eyes that had already learned to measure who might be safe. "Hello," Alexandra said, and for the first time in weeks, the label that stuck to her, CEO, donor, the woman in so many frames, felt like a costume she'd been taught to hold lightly. She offered no name plaque, no certificate. She offered hands that had been roughened by power, but now tried simply to be steady. Bernard met her in the doorway to the bedroom. He had the look of someone who had not slept enough in a string of nights. There was a feverish flush about his cheeks, a tremor at the lip of his voice. He was wearing the coat that had done double duty as both armor and drapery for the strains of too many days. "You shouldn't have to come here," Bernard said, every syllable a small, guarded thing. There was an economy to his hospitality. He stepped back so she could come inside, but did not offer the sort of performance that suggested he expected miracles. "I wanted to say thank you properly," she said. The phrase felt small now, because whatever gratitude could be transmitted from a woman worth more than most small towns to a man who'd never sought notice would never match the cost of the smear he'd already absorbed. She had other things in her mind: interviews with counsel, draft statements, the architecture of restitution, but the first thing she wanted was to meet the human someone had reduced to a frame.
Bernard softened in the presence of Molly, who came forward with a book clutched to her chest and a question at the corner of her mouth. "Are you the lady on TV?" she asked in the blunt, bright way children do when their world shrinks to the size of a living room. Alexandra crouched so she could be at Molly's level. Her fingers, educated in very particular outward gestures, found a different kind of contact, a small hand in hers. "I'm the lady who's very grateful," she said, and the words were true and inadequate both. She lingered in that apartment longer than she'd intended. She sat at the same kitchen table where Bernard had eaten more nights than she could have guessed, and she watched the crease at the corner of an old photograph that sat in the microwave shadow, a classroom of children and a man in the center with a badge that read, B. Kellerman, Principal. The badge was exactly as Bernard had kept it, worn, the edges softened like a coin kept in a pocket. He told her the story, not as one confessional sermon, but as a matter-of-fact ledger of choices. Lincoln Elementary had been a place he loved, the kind of school whose floors remembered wax and whose windows had been finger-smeared with learning. Budget lines contracted, programs were cut. Bernard's job was folded into a spreadsheet and unspooled into a layoff list. He took night shifts to keep the rent paid and ensure Molly had art supplies and warm socks. He taught reading at the church in the evenings. He carried the shapes of classrooms in his hands like the memory of melody. I didn't want the kids to lose the reading program, he said. It was that simple. Alexandra watched him speak and found her curiosity curdle into a sharper sensation. Remorse, yes, but also something like a moral obligation she could no longer delegate. She listened to the facts rather than the first headlines and felt the tension between 1,000 small choices and the one image that had distorted them into a narrative that had hurt a man and his family. That night, Bernard turned a fever complaint into a fatigue conversation, and Alexandra's concern shifted from moral to immediate. He had been working extra shifts on groceries and soup and school notes and had gone without rest. She watched him rise slowly from his chair and felt with a clarity that surprised her that her next steps could not be all press releases and checks. They had to be practical. The nearest hospital's emergency room was full of the city's ordinary hurts. Alexandra, who had court calendars and private surgeons on speed dial for things the rest of the world might call life-changing, did something simpler and more human. She took Bernard's hand as he climbed into the ambulance on a chilly night and followed the truck to the ER in a sedan, driving slowly behind with no one to herald the choice but her own conscience. The ER took him in, and someone took his temperature properly for the first time in days.
He had a low-grade infection brought on by exhaustion, dehydration, and a body not being given the space to rest. The doctors treated him, administered IV fluids, and suggested a short stay for observation. Alexandra sat in the fluorescent corridor and felt the odd, edgeless time that nurses and wards give to the attentive, the rhythm of chair creaks, the clang of carts, the muted list of updates transmitted in small, efficient bursts. Molly was allowed in because the doctors judged a parent's presence a concrete medicine of its own. She sat with a paper cup of water and traced shapes on a paper placemat. Janet hovered at the edge like a lighthouse, fierce with practical care. Alexandra watched all of them, daughter, neighbor, caretaker, and thought about the strain a smear could make on a family like glass being repeatedly tapped. In the hospital room, conversation moved to the public. People called with condolences and offers that often carried an ache of being paid for emotion. Reporters called in numbers, PR staff texted statements. Alexandra made a choice. She would not let another headline decide how Bernard's life would unfold. But she also knew that one woman's apology, however honest, could not undo the mechanics that had produced the smear, nor the structures that made workers expendable. She asked her counsel to prepare two things. First, an immediate, notarized public statement clearing Bernard of wrongdoing and acknowledging the out-of-context nature of the photograph. Second, a plan to address the systemic vulnerabilities the company's events created, a program funded and operational to protect and uplift contract workers and low-wage staff. The first would be fast, the second would take work, negotiation, and the kind of friction that made corporate boards bristle. When news of Alexandra's private visit leaked, someone in security had an old-fashioned sense of human concealment, and the sight of a CEO at a neighborhood flat was a different kind of story. The press filled the day with a meta-narrative. But she had already decided she would be visible in a different sense, accountable, not performative. She stood before a press conference the next morning and read aloud the statement she had instructed be notarized. She did not stage a grand pronouncement. The language was plain and specific, an apology for the premature judgment of Bernard Kellerman, an acknowledgement that the single frame circulated online had been misleading, and an offer to meet privately to discuss restitution. The words landed unevenly across the room. Some reporters pressed for theatrics, others simply noted the change and moved on. But for Bernard, and perhaps more importantly for the families who had watched their lives shudder in headlines, the note meant a different kind of air. That morning, back at his apartment, Bernard read the statement with a kind of detached surprise. He had not expected an apology to be notarized, nor had he expected housing offers or direct contact from the woman whose life he'd pressed back into breath. It was a start, he thought, and he kept one hand on Molly's shoulder while he read. Restitution is never a single action. Alexandra made sure it was thorough. The company advanced funds for Bernard's immediate medical needs. They arranged for temporary housing that was private and dignified. No reporters, no staged photos,
and they set up a small trust that covered rent arrears and immediate childcare. She met Bernard in meetings that were oddly vulnerable. She listened to him describe, with the specificity of a lifelong educator, the practical ways corporate systems could be altered to reduce harm: reliable scheduling for contracted staff, on-site rest spaces away from the optics of main-floor spectacle, pediatric care access for children of low-wage workers, and a policy that would protect anyone who performed life-saving acts from being publicly punished before context was established. Bernard surprised her in the meetings. He had an uncanny ability to convert indignation into policy. Where she had drafted statements, he drew workflows that would route problems before they hatched. He sketched ideas for a modest internal welfare fund, seeded by company contributions and matched by a foundation he trusted. He proposed a program to pair school reading incentives with corporate volunteer programs, an act of practical return to the community that had once been his professional home. The plans were both human and logistical, built by someone who had taught children how to map their days. It was a natural step for Alexandra to offer him a role in designing the initiative, though she did not dream of making him a figurehead. She wanted his expertise, raw and community-rooted. She wanted the program not to be a press release, but a living thing with a backbone. Bernard accepted, wary of publicity and wary of being folded into another narrative that would swallow the quiet work he'd always believed in. He agreed to consult, and eventually to take a leadership role that allowed him both to remain near his daughter and to design the kinds of protections he'd always wanted for frontline workers. Not everyone inside the company moved toward this vision with equal enthusiasm. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, saw the whole affair as a threat to a carefully ordered ledger of risk and reputation. To him, the world was measured in margins and predictable cycles. A smear that disrupted those cycles was dangerous because it introduced volatility. Tyler argued that publicized, sweeping changes would be expensive and could invite legal exposure. He began quietly to build a narrative of his own, that Bernard's identity was an unreliable asset, that a man who had lost a principalship years ago could not be the architect of structural change, that the company needed to be cautious. Tyler's caution bled into action. He commissioned an internal review of Bernard's background and leaked selected, ambiguous findings to friendly reporters in an effort meant to muddy the water. Documents that listed Bernard as a former employee of a school district that had, in fiscal years past, restructured many positions. The implied narrative read cleanly in column mentions. He had been unemployed, he had been a janitor by choice, or worse, he had used whatever small proximity to gain favor. Tyler's pieces were surgical. He did not lie outright, but he nudged public attention toward questions he hoped would slow Alexandra's momentum. Alexandra had anticipated resistance. She had not, however, anticipated the speed with which board politics could calcify around status quo comforts. She found herself in rooms with board members who wanted to wait and see, who preferred the smooth bread of caution to the sour, leavened work of change. Tyler argued that the company could not allow a single incident to dictate policy. He argued budgets and risk assessments in tones that were practiced and persuasive. The tension boiled into a series of staff town halls, where Bernard found himself speaking in public more than he'd planned. Town halls were rough at first. Employees who had only ever been seen as cogs in a polished machine responded with a variety of voices: relief, skepticism, anger. Facility staff spoke about dignity in the break room and the need for predictable shifts. Contract workers described being yanked from schedules with little notice. Parents asked about childcare subsidies. A woman from shipping wept as she told a story about missing a doctor's appointments because she couldn't get coverage. Bernard listened. He had learned in schools that the best lesson plans started with listening. He heard, he took notes, and he organized solutions around what he heard. At first, progress was halting. Tyler's office continued to push back. He arranged for an audit that emphasized cost exposure and publicly questioned the efficacy of what he called benevolent programs. Some middle managers, afraid of being blamed for budget lines, dragged their feet. There were votes to be taken and committees to be convened. Resistance was not villainous so much as frictional. Systems resist strange new motions because they are built to conserve. Bernard's approach was not to out-yell the resistance, but to out-plan it. He piloted a modest program within one division, a childcare stipend for a cohort of contracted night shift workers, and a modest shuttle service to link vulnerable neighborhoods to major sites after late shifts. He insisted on measurable metrics: fewer missed shifts, a reduction in turnover on a pilot floor, improved punctuality for training sessions.
He made the program inexpensive but visible, designed to win hearts with concrete help rather than flourish. The pilot yielded results that could not be ignored. Units that used the shuttle had fewer missed shifts.
Parents on the stipend could attend school meetings they had missed before. The numbers, small but real, began to argue in a language the finance department could parse. Tyler, who watched margins with binocular attention, had to concede statistical improvements, even if he continued to grumble about precedent. But Tyler's war was one of optics as much as ledger. He encouraged a media narrative that suggested Bernard's grievances were recent and opportunistic. A smear so subtle that it felt sanitized was deployed. Questions about Bernard's current qualifications, emphases on the fact that his principal role had been eliminated years ago, hints that he might be more useful as an occasional consultant than the architect of corporate policy. Alexandra countered by making Bernard's competence impossible to lampoon. She made him the public face of specific initiatives and insisted on transparency. When Tyler produced documents, Alexandra produced parents and workers who attested to the way Bernard's programs saved them time and preserved incomes. At times, the infighting grew loud enough that it became its own story. Tyler publicly suggested that some changes might invite lawsuits because they could be framed as uneven application of benefits. He argued strongly for a slow, legal-first approach. Alexandra, whose moral clock had shifted, argued for speed, allied with legal wisdom. She recognized that the woman who had been humiliated in a boardroom and the man who had been forced into invisible work both needed to see action that was not merely symbolic. Behind the scenes, there were daily practicalities. Bernard organized training sessions for managers on dignity and scheduling fairness. He created a simple handbook, predictable shifts, clear notice periods for schedule changes, guaranteed breaks, and an expedited pathway for grievances that did not put workers at the mercy of PR cycles. He worked with on-site medical teams to set up a voucher system for urgent care and pediatric checkups, negotiated with vendors for discounted rates on after-school programs, and insisted that any security footage of concerning incidents be subject to a respectful review before public release. The company as a whole changed slowly. The welfare fund was seeded with a corporate gift, while Alexandra and Bernard set out to attract outside philanthropic partners who had been watching the story unfold. Publicly, the story turned from scandal to reform, in the way a river bends around a rock, inevitably with bruising, but nonetheless shifting the course over time. Local labor groups and nonprofits rallied around the program. Other companies' HR directors, first skeptical, came to see the pilot data and asked to replicate the model. What had started as a moment of private shame for many became a software blueprint for dignity in the workplace. Tyler did not disappear. He adapted.
He called for more rigorous reporting standards. He demanded incremental pilots. He made sure legal frameworks were consulted. In office corridors, the argument sometimes felt like one between the person who feared disruption and the person who had been forced into transformation. There were moments when Tyler's resistance felt less like plotting and more like an institutional muscle refusing to atrophy overnight. The smear campaign outside the company persisted in softer forms. Online commentators honed in on every misstep as proof of something larger. But the public apology and the notarized statement had shifted many viewers' sympathies. People began asking why a man who had put his hands on another human being's chest would be punished for what everyone acknowledged could save a life. Community groups organized petitions. A coalition of mothers from neighborhoods where the company ran events began to write letters to the press about the nonsense of a world that condemned a rescuer because of status. Bernard found himself speaking at a modest press event months later, not as a symbol, but as a working architect of a program that had already begun to change the daily math of dozens of families. He was nervous before the speech. Public exposure had not been his preference. But Molly clapped wildly in the front row with Janet next to her, and the few faces he recognized in the crowd, friends from the after-school program, parents he'd helped, gave him steadiness. His speech was spare. He did not shout at Tyler or at the world. He told the crowd what he had always believed, that dignity is practical, not performative. He spoke of break rooms, of predictable schedules that let a mother bring a child to a dentist, of the small, steady wins that make the difference between feeding a kid and going without. He spoke of the moment in the boardroom and said the words he might never have believed he could say so publicly, that he had been humiliated, and that humiliation had been painful not just to him, but to his child. But he framed the pain in a language of hope. The embarrassment had been a wound, yes, but it had also produced a plan to stitch things differently. That speech was the hinge. It did not end the resistance, but it shifted public attention. A trade publication did a feature on the pilot data. A few mid-sized companies reached out to replicate the program. A nonprofit offered implementation support for the childcare vouchers. The language of the conversation moved from who was right to what could be done.
Legally, the company also acted. Managers who had jumped to judgment without proper review were disciplined. Security officers who had handled the boardroom situation clumsily were reassigned pending retraining. These measures were contested behind closed doors. Tyler argued they were endangered choices. Alexandra accepted the friction.
She understood that leadership cost more than a press release and less than the absolute moral certainty of a yesterday's headline. In public, Alexandra spoke of responsibility. She did not use the event to build a pedestal for herself. Instead, she framed it as a failure of process that required structural rework. She visited Lincoln Elementary and sat in a second-grade classroom with children who colored suns and doors, and who only understood her as the woman who'd stepped into their world for a few hours. She listened to teachers speak of schedules and supplies. She pledged funding, not as a handout, but as partnership. Money for reading materials, a small grant for a school garden, a scholarship fund for summer programs. That money was accompanied by an insistence that the initiatives be community-led and guided by those who had lived the problems. The story began to ripple. A nearby company adopted a version of the shuttle program. A small consortium of firms pooled resources to fund an after-hours childcare cooperative. A local city council member, watching the public momentum, proposed a non-binding resolution encouraging fair scheduling practices for contracted workers. None of these moves fixed history. None erased the smear frames that had once defined Bernard's public image. But the work created a scaffolding where dignity had been shaky. There were setbacks. An implementation error in one district misallocated funds and produced a headline questioning the program's efficacy. Tyler leaked an internal audit drafted in a worst-case analytic tone to friendly outlets to argue for slower rollouts. There were late-night op-eds that tried to paint Bernard as a convenient face rather than a competent director. Each setback required practical countermeasures, clearer data, better audits, stronger oversight. Bernard learned to defend numbers and to tell stories with a quiet, precise confidence that carried more weight than the manufactured gossip. The conference where Bernard later spoke on a national stage was not the one-hour viral spectacle many imagined. It was the result of months and small victories and an accumulation of results. Families helped, absenteeism reduced, retention improved. He spoke about the lessons a school taught him, about organizing time, about the dignity of small rituals, about the value of being seen, and he did so without theatricality. He left room for the audience to absorb rather than applaud. The applause when it came was patient and sustained, led by Molly, who had learned to watch a father turn private grief into public good. In the months that followed, Alexandra pushed for a permanent position within the company, a director of employee well-being, designed to institutionalize the work Bernard had begun. The role had defined powers, a modest budget, the authority to hold managers accountable for scheduling and benefits, the ability to pilot programs across divisions. Tyler argued for limits. Board members negotiated lines. In the end, the post was created with checks and balances, precisely to ensure it could scale without creating dependency or being misused as PR theater. Bernard took the job with an old public school leader's humility. He did not want a title for the sake of a title. He wanted the capacity to ensure that no single headline could cost a family everything. His first order of business was small and deliberate, establishing a 24-hour hotline for contracted workers to report scheduling conflicts in a small emergency fund protocol to cover a day's rent or a sudden childcare need. The hotline was simple, anonymous, and a relief beyond its dollars. People called with needs and hung up with a measure of dignity restored. He kept teaching in small ways. On Wednesdays, he still read to kids in the church basement, his voice low and patient. The reading program continued under the new partnership, financed in a way that guaranteed its survival beyond the fluctuations of political winds. Molly continued to be the bright center of his life. She had a new kind of security now, and her drawing of a sun and a heart stayed taped to the refrigerator like a talisman. Tyler's resistance softened over time, not because he had a change of heart, but because the numbers required it. He found some grudging respect for the outcomes and for the fact that a company with fewer disruptions saved more than money. It retained institutional knowledge, trust in the quiet labor of people who could now plan their lives. He did not apologize publicly. In private, he began to ask Bernard practical questions about scaling logistics and cost efficiencies. Bernard answered with the same patient planning he had used in school assemblies. He mapped schedules and proposed rotation models that would keep costs reasonable while protecting workers. Outside, the public conversation evolved. The smear that had once shaped Bernard's image existed now as a footnote in a longer story of restitution. People still remembered the photograph because images endure longer than explanations, but many began to see the sequence behind it. A rescue, a rush to judgment,
a restitution that led to policy. The narrative changed not because headlines were forced to change, but because a set of practical, measurable results made the news story sturdier. Alexandra, for her part, never stopped wrestling with the disquiet that led her to act. She did not use Bernard's rescue as a means to rewrite her life's ledger into heroism. She used it as a hinge. She tightened processes around corporate events, insisted on redefined vendor contracts that included worker protections, and redirected philanthropy toward community-designed programs rather than vanity projects. She made sure the company's language about worker dignity appeared not as a slogan, but as a clause in procurement policies.
The changes were messy, bureaucratic, and often incomplete, but they were more durable than a single life-changing check. When the program's first year report was published, it did not read like a press release. It read like a ledger of small changes. The number of families helped by emergency vouchers, the percentage drop in missed shifts, the hours of childcare subsidized, and testimonials from mothers and fathers who could now attend school meetings and keep their jobs. It listed the names of the frontline workers who had been part of pilot committees and highlighted their input in policy design. Bernard's name appeared in the credits not as a celebrity, but as a builder. There were those who still clung to their initial judgments, and the internet continued to have its seasons of outrage. But the slow, human work of practice and accountability lessened the power of the smear. People found in their own neighborhoods and workplaces the same kinds of gains Bernard had fought to construct. Small policies spread and were adapted to local needs. Lincoln Elementary received more volunteers and a small grant to repair the playground, and the kids started a newsletter about what they read each week. On a warm evening, months after the first collapse in the boardroom and the smear that followed it, Bernard and Molly stood on the narrow balcony of a small apartment that had become a little steadier. An apartment where the radiator did not growl as loudly, and where there was, most nights, a little more food in the pantry. The city spread out below them in a quilt of lights. Molly traced the cracks in the concrete with her finger like a treasure map. "Do you remember when we drew suns?" she asked. Her voice had the clean, testing quality of a child who wants reassurance. "I remember," Bernard said. He wrapped an arm around her and thought of the morning when he'd left the mop by the east wall and moved toward a person in need. The memory sat beside him like a small stone he'd kept in his pocket. She held up a new drawing, crayon pressed into paper with a kindness that tempered the edges. It was not just a sun now. There was a small door with a heart on it and a figure standing in the doorway. "That's us," she said. Bernard looked at the drawing and then at the city. He thought of humiliation and of mercy, of being pushed toward the edges, and of being pulled into long tables of people who made things real. He thought of the principal he had been, and was in some ways still, someone who kept lists and checked names, and believed that small rituals anchored children's days. Down the block, a man he'd once known as a security officer had taken a different post after a retraining program, and a program benefiting contract workers had just expanded to 2 more cities. Alexandra had begun to speak at gatherings about responsibility and about the dangers of quick judgment, but she rarely framed herself as redeemed. She framed herself as moved.
Molly yawned and tucked her drawing into a pocket of Bernard's jacket. "Will you read to me tomorrow?" she asked, already half asleep. "Always," he said. He kissed her forehead the way a principal might tuck a child into a row of chairs at story time, final, careful, filled with the ordinary courage of someone who plans for the next day. They stayed on the balcony in companionable silence, listening to the city breathe, the distant siren, the beat of a late truck, the soft slap of a neighbor's door. The night remembered the boardroom light and the hush that had fallen when breath was at risk. It also remembered the long, slow work of mending. When Bernard thought about the moment in the boardroom now, it felt less like a scar and more like a seam. It was a seam that held a story, a man who moved when others froze, a woman who learned to look, a society slightly altered because one person's courage did not get swallowed by a single photograph. He had been humiliated, publicly and painfully. He had, in time, been seen. That night, as the city settled and Molly's breathing evened out, Alexandra stood in her own apartment across town and watched a video Bernard had recorded for a staff meeting.
He spoke in his patient, organized way about the importance of listening to the people who keep a company running, the custodians, the drivers, the contracted hands who often carried the real burdens of daily life. He did not ask for adulation. He asked for dignity. Alexandra let a small smile appear and then turned away to write a note, not a press release, but a private letter to Bernard that thanked him again and promised to keep pushing. She read it once, folded it, and then put it in an envelope and sent it with a promise that the company would honor more than words. In the end, the most durable change was not in a headline, but in a pattern. A policy that meant a mother would not have to choose between a paycheck and a doctor's visit, a shuttle that brought late shift workers home, a school garden that got new soil because funding had been rerouted from a pet project to a program that fed children hands-on. These were small things, practical and stubborn, the set of rearrangements that make life slightly more bearable for people who have been treated as invisible. A month later, at a modest ceremony, the company announced the Ashcroft-Kellerman Employee Welfare Initiative. The name sat awkwardly on the plaque because neither party wanted to be the center of attention. The plaque was small and precise, located near an employee entrance, and the words meant to anchor the work as ongoing rather than headline-bound. Bernard stood beside Alexandra, and for a moment their hands brushed. No cameras caught theatrical gestures, only two people who had been present at both the failure and the repair.
When reporters asked about it afterward, Bernard said something simple. "We just made a tiny promise to each other, that the next person who saves someone should not be punished for it, that we would make sure people are seen and protected before the world decides their story." The phrase spread not because it was elegant, but because it said something practical and true. Tyler attended the ceremony and applauded, less loudly than others, but with the faint shifting posture of someone who was learning to live with a new metric. He did not become a convert overnight, but the program's early data and the steady patience of Bernard's work made resistance less coherent. Tyler began to ask the kind of implementation questions that signal the beginning of grudging acceptance. Molly's drawing stayed on the refrigerator, the door with a heart now a little smudged from being touched. This was the image Bernard kept when the city's light narrowed and the headlines shrank. He had been humiliated. He had loved and taught and cleaned and been reduced to a frame in a morning's rush to judgment. He had, however, returned, not to the old title as a badge, but to work that fit the life he wanted, a job that used his skills and protected people he loved. On a morning a year removed from the boardroom incident, Bernard and Molly walked past the building where the Ashcroft annual gala took place. The facade had been washed, the steps were as immaculate as ever. They paused across the street and watched as a shuttle from the welfare initiative rolled by, taking 3 young mothers home after a late shift. Bernard watched their faces, the way relief softened the corners of their mouths, and he felt quietly that the world had shifted enough in one small sector to matter. Molly tugged at his sleeve and pointed at a man who was sweeping the corner stoop. "He's sweeping like you," she said, the kind of observation children make that has no irony. Bernard smiled and ruffled her hair. They crossed the street and entered the small park where the reading program held sessions. Children clustered on a quilt, and Bernard sat down on the fringe and began to read aloud, his voice soft and sure. Someone in the crowd looked up and recognized him from the conference and smiled with something like gratitude. He read on, not for applause, but because it was what he had always done. When the last line of the story had been told by enough people, it became less a spectacle and more a memory stitched into a neighborhood's daily fabric. A millionaire mom had humiliated a janitor. She hadn't known he was the principal in disguise. That sentence had once been a headline, blunt and cruel. Now it read as the opening to a longer sentence about human fallibility and the slow work of making reparations. People used it to begin conversations, to teach children about the cost of quick judgments and the value of being seen.
The city continued to breathe its complicated breath. Sirens still occasionally wailed, trains still clattered, and headlines still sharpened and dulled with a fickle appetite. But in the apartments and in the small offices and in the quiet rooms where people folded lists and brushed hair and paid bills, things had shifted. A practical promise had been made and kept. A child drew suns and doors with hearts. A man who had once been unseen returned to a life that allowed him to keep watching over small, important things. If this story touched you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to be reminded. Everyone deserves to be seen.